introductory matter, there are some materials in the back. You can pick them up now or on your way out. There's also a sign-up sheet if you want to be like on an email list about more information on this topic. And so I guess we can begin. Hi, my name is Nicole Ochi. I am a litigation attorney with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles, and we are here today to discuss affirmative action and Asian Americans, which, as you probably know, has been a topic of considerable media attention lately because of the Harvard case. So I actually represent some Harvard students in the case who support affirmative action policies. And I've also been involved in several amicus briefs related to affirmative action before the Supreme Court. So today I'm joined by a really amazing panel. To my immediate left is Oyeon Poon from Colorado State University, who is a nationally recognized affirmative action expert. And also Stephen Chen, who is from CRW Strategy Group, which is an ethnic media consulting firm. Stephen is a microblogger on WeChat, which we'll talk about a lot today, and really a great strategist and contributor to our movement. And to his left is Quinn Din, the executive director of CRAC, which stands for the Southeast Asian Resource Action Center, and she brings more than a decade of experience as a social justice advocate, and she's been a national leader on the related issue of data disaggregation, which we'll also get into. And last but not least is David Hawkins, who's the Executive Director for Educational Content and Policy for the National Association for College Admissions Counseling. So he's intimately familiar with the holistic admissions process and will share his knowledge with us today. Before we get started, there's two things I wanted to do. One, I wanted to get a sense of the room. So can I just kind of get a sense? Can you raise your hand if you're from the West? California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada-ish. Arizona, okay. And then from the South, awesome. The Midwest, hello. And from the East Coast.
Oh, and the mountains.
And the mountains, I'm sorry.
Anyone?
There's a mountain person back there. Oh no, okay. Anyone from Hawaii? Or anywhere else we missed? No, okay. And then I also want to get a sense, how many of you are students? Yay, students. How many of you work for a university? Hello. And how many of you work for a nonprofit? Lots of folks. Okay, great. Thanks for indulging me in that. So first I want to give a little bit of context about this issue, and our panelists are going to go into much more detail. But just to say some things so that we're all kind of on the same page about this. So as we know, there's a long history of white conservatives using Asian Americans as a racial wedge on affirmative action going back to Reagan in the 1980s. But the pitting of Asian Americans against other communities of color has never gotten as much traction or attention as in the last couple of years. And there's kind of a timeline of events that Oyeon will go through that explains that. But one of the reasons why we're hearing so much about this is because of this lawsuit that was filed by Edward Blum. He is a white conservative kind of strategist who uses litigation to try to roll back all sorts of race-conscious civil rights remedies, including affirmative action, including parts of the Voting Rights Act. And so he actively recruited Asian Americans to be part of a lawsuit against Harvard. In the past, he used white women to further his causes. And then he filed a lawsuit in November 2014 against Harvard for intentionally discriminating against Asian Americans through their race-conscious admissions policy, or their affirmative action policy. That case will go to trial this October, so you're going to hear a lot more about this issue. About 6 months later or so, there was a group called Asian American Coalition for Education that is a coalition of predominantly Chinese groups that filed a Department of Justice complaint against Harvard, arguing essentially the same thing. So that's perhaps some of the news that you've heard more recently. Because in 2015, under the Obama administration, they did not investigate that complaint, given the pending lawsuit. But under this current administration, last year in 2017, they opened their own investigation. And so that's why you're hearing a lot about DOJ and all of that. So, on its face, whether or not Harvard uses race in its admissions policy does feel like an elite issue. I've heard that from a lot of people. And while it's true that affirmative action policies are like a limited remedy, and particularly at elite schools like Harvard, it's not like it affects like a lot of people, but I think, and I think our panelists think, that this battle over affirmative action policies at Harvard really is important because it's really a referendum on race in America and Asian Americans and our place in it. And further, it has a lot of broader implications because it has bled into things like data disaggregation, which is so crucial for so many of our communities to tell their stories and get the funding that they need and deserve to serve those communities. So the implications are much broader than they may seem. So today we're essentially going to have 3 conversations with an opportunity for question and answer after each of them. The first one around understanding affirmative action because it is something that is widely misunderstood by so many people. And the second is to understand the grassroots movement sparked by affirmative action. And third, identifying strategies to take back this narrative. So I feel like I've been talking for a long time. I don't really want to talk anymore. But I was supposed to give, really briefly, the legal framework for understanding affirmative action. So I'll try to do this really fast. As you probably know, affirmative action was a product of the civil rights movement, right? It was a recognition that laws that prohibited discrimination don't do enough to remedy the effects of past discrimination and structural racism. And so that was its intent. It did not start in admissions and higher education. It started in public employment and contracting. That was its origin. But over time, it's been sort of equated only with higher education, and the rationale for using it has greatly narrowed. So if you think about this was in a really great article by Vox recently, I don't want to turn into myself, but it's like this broad road to end discrimination, right? But with every Supreme Court case, it's been narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. So the first thing was Bakke, which was 30 years ago or more now, I don't know, 40 years ago. And that
40 years ago.
Huh?
40 years ago.
Was it 40?
Yeah,
I can't do my math.
78.
Yeah, that's 40. Trust me, I was born before then.
Wow. 40 years ago, right? For 40 years, the Supreme Court has said that quotas are illegal in admissions. Quotas meaning that you can't, set aside spots for certain members of racial groups, that you can't have them only competing against each other. And even though that happened 40 years ago, today, right now, in 2018, you hear all over the place that affirmative action equals quotas. Affirmative action does not equal quotas. Okay, so after Bakke, 40 years ago, there was further narrowing in subsequent cases. I don't need to name all the cases, but basically, further Supreme Court decisions kind of specified you can't even use a point system, you can't assign specific points for race.
No bonus.
No bonus, right?
No bonus.
And that it can only be used as one factor. And finally, in the most recent Supreme Court decision, which was in 2016 in the Fisher case, in that case they said race can only be used as a factor of a factor of a factor, alongside other kind of contextual circumstances like class. So that's another thing you always hear. It's we care about disadvantaged people. And it's well, affirmative action already takes that into account, right? That we're really talking about does race matter? So anyway, factor of a factor of a factor. And you can't even consider it as a factor of a factor of a factor unless you've tried race-neutral alternatives. And we know from our experiences in California, I'm from California, with the UC system, we've tried race-neutral alternatives for, I can't do my math again, 20 years. 22 years in California. Never, ever have we reached the same levels of diversity, right? In UT Austin, that actual case, they tried race-neutral alternatives, didn't work. Anyways, that is the legal framework for affirmative action, and now I will turn it over to David to talk about how this kind of holistic admissions process, which is the only way in which race is considered today, looks in practice.
Or of leadership potential, engagement, and working across cultures. That first example demonstrates that. If you were to call this a race or ethnicity blind process, I question whether or not the fullness and the wholeness of this story could be accounted for within the admission process, right? So you see how race and ethnicity is embedded in such a narrative, right? In the second example, the student has led a school-wide effort to address racial tensions and conflict and discusses, again, in the essay, meaningfully, how being Asian American has uniquely positioned them to do this work well. This is a racialized narrative. This is a narrative of experiences of race and racism. What could this demonstrate? It could demonstrate, again, community service, leadership, engagement and diversity, problem solving, right? Like engaging cross-culture, all kinds of things. And this is just very limited things. Because here's another question for y'all. How many characteristics or factors do you think sometimes gets reviewed within the process? So we've already talked tests, grades, that's 2. How many factors do you think colleges and universities can look at when selecting students? Dozens?
As many as they want.
As many as they want, that's key. Very, very key. I know a middle-of-the-road private university in the Midwest with a pretty solid reputation that considers over 900 factors. I would like to see that computer calculating that. Because one of the most popular factors that rarely gets talked about is ability to pay. Right? Because this is a system of enrollment management. So when you're talking about colleges and universities that are being publicly divested from, struggling to pay the bills, they're going to be, but also still trying to meet a mission of serving, people of all kinds of backgrounds, economic included. In order to pay for that working class student for 4 years, they need to admit a couple of students who can pay full price, right? So you need to balance that, because at the end of the day, you gotta pay the electric bill, right? And so there's things like that. So there's all kind of factors that are balanced within this equation. And there's also a big factor of predicting academic success, right? So that, retention. They don't want to see people leaving, and they want to see persistence. So they have, this is called big data, right? We've been talking about big data with Facebook. Colleges and universities are experts at big data, at prediction models and everything. I mean, the statistical modeling is out of just really intense. So the point I want to make here is, with the Texas case, what was really interesting is that once Texas began to use their holistic review process, so under affirmative action, Asian American students increased. So when there's this myth out there, and I can break down, people always cite University of California, Caltech, under a race-blind, race-neutral policy, Asian American numbers go up. I can break down for you in so many basic math ways why those arguments are wrong. Or even the Espenshade study that gets claimed all the time. Oh, Asian Americans have to score 100 and some odd more points to get in compared to the same student who happens to be Black or Latino. I can break down for you how that is all mathematically incorrect. I'll give you one thing. That data was from 1997. That's 21 years ago. That's 4 Supreme Court cases ago, right? You can live in 1997 if you'd like, but that's not an appropriate way to talk about what's at stake today. So I will end there for now and pass it on to Quinn.
Great. So just really quick before we go on to Quinn, I also just wanted to emphasize this point. Just mention that like I said, I represent about 5 or 6 current Harvard students. I've seen their application essays. I know what schools they applied to, which ones they got into, which ones they didn't. I would say the ones with the highest test scores, near perfect, near 2,400, Harvard was the only Ivy League they got into. They did apply early action to Yale or some other school and were rejected to all of the other ones. And that's because of how this policy works. That's what the institution is looking for and all these other factors. And the ones that got in to more than one had lower than average SAT scores, but had all of this in there. So anyways, just to move on, to talk for Quinn, if you could just talk a little bit about the additional work that's needed.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Quinn Den. I'm the Executive Director of CRAC, the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. I don't understand, I'm like so short. No. So CIRAC represents the largest community of refugees ever to be resettled in America, meaning we represent folks from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos who came as refugees after the U.S. occupation throughout Southeast Asia. What we have seen and what's at stake for us at CIRAC is really the question of, are Asian Americans still facing injustice within education? And all the data that we know about our communities, not just through census data, but also through our lived experience, is that absolutely yes. For Southeast Asian Americans, you can see here, this is data from the 2010 census. Over 60% of Hmong, Laotian, and Cambodian Americans don't have a college degree. And for Vietnamese, it's about 51%. And on the bottom part is also the Pacific Islander data, where upwards of 50% and more of Pacific Islander communities don't have a college degree. So if you think about that, just let that sit with you for a little bit. That means that in this room, if we represent the Southeast Asian American community, over half of this room would be standing up saying, I don't have a college degree, for both the Southeast Asian American and Pacific Islander community. For CIRAC, that means that there is some sort of injustice happening to our communities. And what we know from our experience is that our communities, by and large, face so many challenges that are similar to other low-income immigrant students of color. We know that predominantly our communities come from homes where English is spoken less than very well. So whereas only 9% of US speakers speak English less than very well, this is true for between 39 and 52% of our communities. We also know that predominantly our communities come from low-income communities, where although only 11% of US families live in poverty, this is twice the rate for the Hmong community at 27%, 18% for Cambodian Americans, and they're both higher than 12% for both the Laotian and Vietnamese American community. And finally, there are extreme cultural barriers coming as refugees from countries where this education system is completely new. We've seen data and research from first-generation college students, such as myself, on what are some of the challenges that you face in actually accessing college and to completing it. Challenges that you can't imagine already. Being able to afford a college education is one of the highest, as folks oftentimes are also working multiple jobs and taking care of their families. We also know that even navigating the college application process itself is completely, it's so terrifying and scary and filled with lots of barriers that you alone are the first ones in your family to have to overcome to be able to get this degree. And I think, sorry. Is it not the right order? Maybe. Because I wasn't sure. Sorry. Let's see. And then we'll do both. I'll come back to it. What's at stake for CIRAC and for me is that this conversation is so personal. My parents left Vietnam as refugees, not knowing if they would live or die, so that I would have a better future than they could ever have. I am the first in my family to ever have a college degree. My parents didn't have a college degree, my grandparents didn't have a college degree, my great-grandparents certainly didn't have a college degree. So I was the hope for my family for this freedom and liberation. And so we understand that this fight for equity and for education is so highly personal, not just for folks who have been facing generational barriers to accessing it, but also for these Chinese American students who have had this expectation that this is what it means to be worthy or to have value as my daughter or my son. That is a narrative that we believe is violent and traumatic to really building racial equity across our communities. And this is a picture from a data disaggregation campaign that we launched about 4 years ago, where these are Cambodian American students who were here in DC to share with us that they want disaggregated data because they believe there should be a checkbox that says Cambodian so that they too could be counted. And the vision for America that we see is one where there is opportunity for all of our students, that this is the America that we're building towards of racial equity and racial justice, and that is what is at stake for CRAC in our communities.
I know I promised questions and answers after each conversation, but because we are like way behind time and I don't want to give short shrift to the next conversation, I'm going to just ask that we kind of plug through, and then after that we'll take questions. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the conservative grassroots movement that has been sparked by affirmative action.
So I appreciate Quinn really sharing her narrative and sharing that, you know, as someone who identifies as Chinese American, I may not have a refugee story, but I certainly within my community there are a lot of shared similarities in terms of attitudes and relationships with education. So that's where I'm going to go next, which is a couple years ago I completed a research study trying to understand what is driving the divide on affirmative action within the Asian American community. And so I reached out to all the Asian American organizations that have publicly advocated for or against affirmative action, engaged in Fisher 1, Fisher 2, SCA 5, OCR complaints, et cetera, anyone who wrote an op-ed I reached out to. And so in the end I got 36 interviews, and I got 19 supporters who were very ethnically diverse. They were mostly women, mostly 1.5 and second generation. Only one identified as a first generation immigrant from China. And then 15 opponents were interviewed. They were all Chinese. Only one identified as woman, and she was a second generation Chinese American. And 11 immigrants out of those 15 that I contacted via WeChat. I secured those interviews mostly through WeChat. And 7 of those 11, so 7 of 15, almost half of these opponents had immigrated to the US after 1990, and this is a very key date, from the People's Republic of China. And then 2 of the 36 identified as having mixed opinions. They weren't sure how they felt about affirmative action, but both of them were also Chinese American. One was an immigrant woman, and the other one was a multi-generational Chinese American man. And that's when I realized I did not anticipate this ethnic difference, this very stark difference, and quite frankly, a gender difference, when I entered this study into this project. What I found from this was a couple of things. Number one, people are completely ignorant on how affirmative action operates. Out of these 36 people, only 6 of them answered correctly when I asked them, how does affirmative action work in college admissions? Several of them were attorneys. But 30 of the 36 were they were like, oh, it's a quota, it's a preference, it's a bonus point, it's, you know, and it's a either for good or bad, right? So the affirmative action supporters were like, it's a quota, but that's a good thing. And in my head, I'm like, but that's not how it works. And you're an advocate. You are a public advocate spreading lies, spreading false information. This is not helping the cause. And that was horrifying for me to find out, that advocates of affirmative action were getting it wrong. None of the opponents got it right. Okay. And out of the 36, 34 of them, when I asked them, so what's the ideal system of college admissions? 34 of them described the system I described for you, which is the current state of affirmative action. Some of them did not use the word holistic review, but they described a holistic process. And I was like, okay, well, how about, like, can race be accounted for in there? And they're like, oh, absolutely, it should be. And these were opponents. So a lot of you are public advocates. Think on that for a second, okay? Like, how are we messaging, and how are we messaging so wrong? When only one opponent said it should only be tests and grades. Only one of them. The rest of them were like, you need to account for life stories. There are people who live and grow up in very disadvantaged circumstances, whether that be due to class or race or immigration status or whatever. We need to understand that in selecting the most talented, the people with the most potential. These were opponents who have been on the news. And it was just astounding to find that out. The other key thing that I learned from this study was WeChat. This study was how I arrived at learning about what WeChat was. My family's from Hong Kong, and my family is very suspicious of things like WeChat because WeChat started in 2011 with the backing of the People's Republic of China, with Beijing's backing. And so my family is not on WeChat, we're on WhatsApp. Anyway. But let me tell you a little bit about WeChat, right? So WeChat started in 2011, and these are numbers in the millions, right? So all the way to the right is Q1. So about this time last year, WeChat had 938 million users. That's growth over 6 years. Okay, so just to give you a scale, how many of you are active on WeChat? Like active with microblogs, this guy here especially, with microblogs as an influencer, like people listen to you.
I personally don't use WeChat, but could you explain to me or everyone what microblogging is, or like what your presence besides like interacting one-on-one with people or in group chats is?
I'm gonna let the expert do that when he's up.
I can show you later.
Yeah, he can do this. Steven is the man when it comes to this stuff. But so here's the thing, right? So WeChat is what has powered, is like the fuel for this hyper-conservative activist movement. So how then did this movement rise up and evolve? I start with 1990. The Immigration Act in 1990 narrowed family reunification numbers, narrowed just all kind. The numbers that went up in the Immigration Act in 1990 was professional class. Okay, so they were going after professional class, people with money, right? It's today's proposed RAISE Act is essentially the 1990 Act on steroids. And then 2011 WeChat launches, and basically the way the movement has developed is community organizing 101. You win, you gain a victory, you gain power, you move on, we win a victory, gain power, move on to the next, right? Jimmy Kimmel. That's how this all started. Does anyone remember, he had a skit in 2013 called Kill Everyone in China. What? It was a bunch of kids, and it was like he calls it the kids table. And this skit was called Kill Everyone in China. And so, I mean, even angry Asian man got on board about like being mad about Jimmy Kimmel. The White House had to intervene because Beijing got pissed off, right? So this became a minor international situation. But because of this, WeChat suddenly took off. Because people were like, we need to show up at the ABC headquarters in New York and LA, and your affiliates, go, 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 right? And so people were mobilizing. They were heading out and protesting. They won that. Jimmy Kimmel apologizes. The next year, SCA 5 in California. Affirmative action is tried to be reinstated. They fight that. SCA 5 dies. They win that. They build stronger. They keep going. The next thing you have, the Peter Liang case in New York City. All right, so, and I think that was the first time maybe the mainstream and larger audiences started realizing, whoa, where did all these immigrant Chinese people come from, right? Like, they're all over the streets,
China.
right? And from China. But like suddenly super civically engaged, like in the streets protesting, right? Marching and all of this. And it was huge, right? So they felt very victorious in that campaign, especially around visibility. And then that same year, you have in California disaggregation bill 1726. That died. They won that. They move on. They keep growing and growing, and it mirrors that growth chart I showed on WeChat users. It just keeps growing. And so then 2015, 14 is when the Blum case gets filed. 2016, Yukong Zhao files the OCR complaints, and he's somewhat of a celebrity on the WeChat circles. And then this year we have the Massachusetts anti-disaggregation rallies, right? So when I'm from Massachusetts, when my friends texted me, where the heck what just happened? Why did the State House just get flooded with people? I was like, I've been warning you since 2015 about these people. Nobody's listening. Like Janelle sounded the alarm, right? Like if you haven't heard, now you know.
Actually, can I talk with this timeline?
Yeah, I'll keep this up, and then finally, what I want to say is now we're moving towards the last thing I want to say is we're moving towards the census, right?
Yeah.
And we have the RAISE Act proposed. So if that passes, there's this narrative in our community, in the second gen and on circles, where we're like, we just have to wait for the older people to die off. Guess what? RAISE Act is 1990 on steroids, and they're just gonna keep coming, and they're all on WeChat. So be scared, but there's hope. There is hope. There is hope. I will. There is hope. Oh yeah, I'll leave that here for you. Yeah.
Very scary. So Stephen is our expert.
Okay.
So please take it away.
Okay, so 1990, right? That's actually time many of those so-called first generation Chinese American came in from mainland China. Actually, Taipei is one of them. I'm one of them. Okay, we came here earlier, right? So then, but most of the time, actually, for many years, we are kind of quiet on the political, and we are not really too much engaged. And 2011, WeChat started, and we get on the WeChat. Then, so Jamie Camille, actually, this one is kind of political neutral. It's not really political ones, but WeChat was used to organize the people and the comments the kids made, actually. Really, the kids made secure all the time, not the Jamie Camille. Okay. So now, SC5, the 2014, the Republican Party or operative, they saw an opportunity on SC5. Because the people, right, we're talking about the people we come in here, mostly professionals, right? We graduate from the top colleges in China, and we actually hope that our children will have better, they will go to better college or equal, right? So the education is the most important things for this group. There is nothing wrong about that, okay? So it's a legitimate design. But when SCE5 came, and because the SCE5 didn't see that, okay, there's no quota, we cannot use the quota. So the other side said, okay, if SCE5 pass, there will be a quota. So what does that mean? At that time, actually, UC, top UC, like UC Berkeley LA, has about 50% Asian Americans or Asian people, right? On some of the very high number. Then, but California, Asian American only have 15% population. So they said if SC5 pass, the number will drop from 50 to 15%. So that is all over the WeChat. So everybody got scared, right? So, I mean, their children couldn't go to top UC system. So that's why you have so many people who are angry with SC5, even many of the progress. Okay, so they grow. Okay, Peter Liao is not too much partisan, but then we have 1726. Okay, yeah. So that is also trying to associate to the college admission. And then it got defeated basically. They took out the education portion, only left the health issue. And then 2016 actually, so they find a lot of help. They donate a lot of money to Ed Bloom and basically maintain his viability. Without this money, Ed Bloom probably couldn't go on. So yeah, so and so now. So there is a hope, okay. So, but that community actually, those are actually good people, okay. They are not like the bad people, but there are somebody who gave out the misinformation and scared everybody away. But the good news is that there are some good organizations like UCA, and also good micro blogs trying to educate them, right? It's not say, oh, you have to support it. It does not necessarily doing that. does not need to do that. Okay, just give out factual information so that people decide what is good for them. And now, yeah. So you want to go on? And I have other
Just
things.
you. It's
Okay.
you.
Oh, it's
Come on,
my.
all you.
It's
All
all
you.
my mind right
Yeah,
now.
right here. All you here.
Uh,
We left the best for last.
Okay. Okay. Can you put on?
Go for it.
So yeah, so this picture, can you go down next one? So this is, oh yeah, by the way, this is the anti-SC5. So if you look at the science, and I study hard, do not reject me into your thesis because I'm my race. So that was the WeChat was telling people, right? If you're Chinese, no matter how hard you study, you'll be rejected. And the people do believe, even the kids probably believe that. Can you use that? So this is for the data disaggregation, and people was also scared about the data disaggregation. It could be used as the AA, or it could be used as the anti-Chinese, China actually. So this has two factors involved. Okay, there you go. No. Oh, no. Can you pull? Yeah.
Want me to open the thing?
Oh, no. It's okay. So recently, right, Alvin Chen actually wrote very good articles, and so it's actually referring to that particular group. If you guys want, you can read. It's very good about the AA. And Oyin actually mentioned his name a while ago.
It's just cut off.
Cut
The
off.
second one, you need to read Stephen's essay, An Elephant in a China Shop. The link is cut off, but just search.
Yeah,
for
actually,
this.
I think I have right. Actually, if you search media, it's published on the media. You search media and search an elephant in the China shop, you will find the article. I wrote the article, and it's talking about this group. Yeah, and so.
And if you leave your name back there, I'll be sure to circulate it too.
Okay, so we are talking about right how to. So what I see that actually they see that is that Asian American organizations, the established organizations, didn't reach out to the WeChat world, and and there are actually volunteers helping the cause you guys at, but we are outnumbered and outfunded. Okay. And so the important thing that what we can do is that, like Oyin trying to do, right? Show them how holistic admission process works, right? So they don't fear for that. And also we should try to provide, tell them that okay, the Ivy League are not the only choice, right? So for your children to be successful, there are so many good colleges over there. They just don't know. So everybody just go to Ivy League, and which they won't be able to get in. So they got angry because they couldn't get in. But if we can show them there are many other colleges, very good ones, they can go and their children will be successful. That will make them happy. Yeah. Okay. I think that's all. I mean, if you guys have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Great, thank you, Stephen.
If I can just highlight, the hope is, so I went back to this slide with Stephen's email address and CRW strategy. This is really important because the way WeChat works, it's not like Facebook or Twitter. I can't just start an account and people are going to read it. People like Stephen have built up a lot of capital and influence in the spaces of WeChat. And so that takes time and energy and effort. There's a few other people like Stephen who have a much more progressive message, but they're all volunteer, they're not paid, and so CRW strategy is a good place to go to if your organization is interested in messaging to the WeChat world, because I'm Chinese American, but I don't read or write Chinese, right? And so someone like Stephen can help me translate, not just linguistically, language-wise, but culturally. Because I'm also, like I said, my family's from Hong Kong. That's very different culturally than from the post-90 immigration patterns from mainland China. So that's what I want to end with. If you have questions, he's the man with WeChat.
Thank you for this discussion. I have a 17-year-old son, and he comes home every day freaking out because there is a classmate whose parents are from China, and she walks in every day and says, "You're male, you're Asian, you're not going to college." Okay, so this has been super useful. But having said that, I was born here. My parents came from China. My father's all over WeChat, and now I'm afraid what he's learning here. So, are there materials available, widely available in Chinese that I can give to him so that he can go in there armed so that it can help you? And I believe that actually this seems to be like almost a generational thing. He came in the 1960s, and he would be willing to do it. He's a Democrat, he votes progressive, but he just doesn't have, he doesn't know this issue. So are there materials in Chinese that I can give?
There is.
Yeah, I actually wrote, and some of my friends also wrote some of those. So if you send me email, I can give to you now. But what we wrote is not enough, right? So hopefully the organizations will actually help OIN to provide more material for this WeChat world. For you, actually, I could send to you, but it's not enough.
There's also a website,
AsianAmericanCivilRights.org.
and there's a link that says Chinese, like a Chinese link.
And I'll also add that our organization is in the process of creating a bunch of community education materials in Chinese that we will distribute. So if you sign up here, then we can get that to you.
Okay, great.
Asking for.
Okay, hold on. Because we only have about